Dr. Gosar of Arizona. He is recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Schapiro, when David Becker, your brand new General Counsel, first came to you in February of 2009 and said, "My mother had an account with Bernie Madoff," why didn't you ask him any questions about it? Why didn't you even ask simple questions like, how much money?
Congressman, to the best of my recollection, and just so I can be clear, I haven't looked at any emails or whether there might be any contemporaneous notes or anything like that from this period of time. So I'm recalling back, because our Inspector General is looking at all this. So I'm recalling back 2 years ago. At the best of my recollection was that Mr. Becker told me that his mother, who had passed away years ago, had had an account at Madoff. I did not, because the account was closed years before, I did not think that the account of a long-deceased relative would raise an issue of a conflict of interest in Mr. Becker's work. I did expect that he would go to the Ethics Council. He is an experienced government official, government lawyer, served under 3 chairmen at the SEC, and we use our Ethics Council all the time for their advice. I expected him to run it by the Ethics Council and to follow their advice, and that's the way it went forward.
It seems that if the same situation existed in a publicly held or traded company that you were investigating, would you turn such a have such a cavalier approach to that?
Well, it's hard for me to imagine this situation. I mean, these are the government ethics rules and the concern about
an ethics rule nonetheless.
It's very hard to answer in the abstract. It would depend on the rule.
It just seems that there's a very different aspect that what's good in the private sector and publicly traded situations is not going well for the government. Let's go to my next question. Ms. Chapman, do you believe that the account valuation method that David Becker recommended to the Commission as its attorney would have benefited his personal financial interest?
There is no question that the constant dollar approach, which apparently Mr. Becker invented, would benefit him personally and reduce his clawback exposure. But the more significant problem with the conflict of interest that Mr. Becker had is that it had clouded his judgment. The law is absolutely clear that every investor is entitled to SIPC insurance based on his last statement. And Mr. Becker had an obligation as the General Counsel of the SEC to make sure that the SEC complied with the law and enforced it against SIPC. And that's the great failure which has caused devastation to all of my clients.
Chairman Schapiro, your agency's Inspector General compiled a 457-page report about the SEC's failure to uncover Madoff's Ponzi scheme. That report devotes 2 sections out of 11 to describing in great detail every possible connection between SEC employees and Madoff. Do you think that your General Counsel's receiving funds from a Madoff account would have been appropriate material to the Inspector General or not?
That would be a much better question for the Inspector General. I have a pretty high level of confidence that he did quite a thorough report on the agency's failures with respect to Madoff.
The Inspector General's Madoff report mentions on page 382 that 2 family members of an employee in the Office of the Internet Enforcement invested $1.5 million and $500,000 respectively with Madoff. The Inspector General found it necessary to make sure that this employee had no involvement in any Madoff examination. Do you think that the Inspector General would have been interested in a similar situation involving your chief lawyer, a senior SEC official who served as General Counsel from 2000 to 2002 while the SEC was ignoring whistleblower complaints about Madoff?
I can't predict. I can imagine that he might have been, and of course he is looking at all of these issues now, and I expect that he will thoroughly explore that.
Well, I understand that you inherited a horrific problem, but that it always starts with top-down. You know, private sector, businesses always look at accountability within the hierarchy. And it seems like we have a two-edged sword here, that we should have demanded a better accountability. Would you agree?
Congressman, I would agree that from where I sit now and understanding all the things that I understand now that I didn't understand in 2009, having arrived at the SEC and discovered that I had an agency in absolute ruin in some regards on my hands to manage, and not knowing, obviously, all the steps that would be taken by the trustee or the decisions the Commission would make down the road. But knowing those things now, I wish that we had I wish that Mr. Becker had recused himself, absolutely.
Gentleman's time is